Good evening, welcome. I'm John. I'm a bookseller at Literati Bookstore in downtown Ann Arbor, Michigan. We're so pleased to welcome Jonathan Lee in support of the paperback release of The Great Mistake and in conversation this evening with Julie Buntin. As a reminder, the chat is closed to you, but you can keep the chat window open. I'll be sharing links to purchase The Great Mistake in paperback throughout the event in the chat. You can also interact with us at any time using the Q&A feature that's available to you at the bottom of your screen. And live transcription is available using the CC icon on your toolbar. If you're watching us later on YouTube, there are always links to purchase books in the description directly below me. And while you're there in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, you'll find a little typewriter button where you can subscribe to our channel. That way you can be kept up to date with all of our at-home with Literati events after they become available there. And as a reminder, you can shop for more books at literatibookstore.com to have shipped to your home anywhere in the United States. And if you live in Southeast Michigan or the Ann Arbor area, of course, our doors are open to the public for in-store shopping. Most of all, we'd just like to thank you for your attendance this evening or this morning or this afternoon or much later this evening. Depending on where and when in the world you may be joining us. So without further ado, I'll introduce tonight's author and our moderator. Jonathan Lee is the author of 3 novels. His novel High Dive was a best book of the year in publications, including the New York Times, The Guardian, The Wall Street Journal, The Washington Post, and the San Francisco Chronicle. He is the editor-in-chief of indie publisher Catapult, and he lives in New York. Joining him in conversation, Julie Buntin grew up in northern Michigan, and her debut novel, Marlena, was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle's John Leonard Prize, translated into 10 languages, and named the best book of the year by over a dozen publications. She teaches creative writing at the University of Michigan. Please join me in welcoming Jonathan Lee and Julie Buntin into your living rooms.
Hey, John.
Hey, Julie.
And thank you, John, at Literati for that lovely introduction of both of us. John, I'm so happy to have you virtually here in Michigan. And I was laughing a little bit when John read your bio because you're not the editor-in-chief of Catapult anymore.
I know. I guess like too busy to actually update my bio, which is a really bad thing. But yeah.
Yeah, but that is how we know each other.
Yeah.
So I think I'd love to just start with you talking a little bit about this beautiful book, and there's a hair tie as a bookmark, and sort of where it came from and what your entry point to the story was, and how you came to this project, basically, like kind of where it began for you and what it's about.
Yeah, I mean, I moved from the UK to New York, as you know, probably like about 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. And I think it was the summer of 2012 when I was like walking around Central Park. I felt like I had more time to like walk and think then. We both had kids since then. And I came across this bench in a sort of seldom visited part of the park that overlooks Fort Fish. And it was dedicated to this guy, Andrew Haswell Green. And on the engraving, it said, "The father of Greater New York, the creating genius of Central Park." And I just got really curious that I hadn't heard of this person. And in a way, it was like trying to investigate that claim that he was the father of Greater New York and cover up for my own feeling that I should know who this was. And probably all of the longer term New Yorkers would know who he was. And then when I dug into it, I found that like he was kind of a mystery to almost everyone.
It's interesting that it sounds like there was this feeling of like other people in New York will know who this is. This is like a New York story that I just have to like stumble into to become like a real part of this place. But actually, I think probably until you wrote this book, this was a story that was lost to most New Yorkers, right? It's not like he was, he's not like a part of history, New York history that I have ever heard of. But as you chronicle his life in this book, when he was alive, it certainly seemed that he would be. And I guess I'm curious about that too. Like, as you did research for this project and kind of learned more about his contributions to what New York is, and I'm hoping you can also talk about what you mean when you say the father of Greater New York and what that meant for him. I guess I'm just curious, like, did that make the project sort of have more like spark or energy for you? This idea that you were bringing to light something that so many people had forgotten that actually had shaped the city that you were living in, or or are there people who are kind of like holding the legacy of the story in different ways? It's just not like our peers Catapult, I guess.
Yeah, there are definitely like a couple of people who I've met along the way or in the research process. One in particular, an ex-Manhattan borough historian who has just like it's kind of been an obsession of his life to look at Green and spread the word about Andrew Haswell Green. But yeah, at the time, like even seeing that he was called the father of Greater New York, it took me a while to piece together that he was this 19th century civic leader who had an amazing ending in that he ended up being murdered on Park Avenue at the age of 83, kind of having created modern New York. He was a person without whom there would be no Central Park, no Metropolitan Museum of Art, no New York Public Library, maybe no merger of Manhattan with Brooklyn into a single city. And he was kind of arguably the greatest creator of public space in the city's history. And yet he's been, almost entirely forgotten, which is surprising. And I feel like I probably have met like only a dozen people, and mainly through the publication of this book, that have heard of him. But I think it did come kind of the urge to find out more about him did partly come from that feeling of inadequacy of being an arrival. And of course, like New York is a city full of arrivals throughout history. But like I always loved that E.B. White essay, Here is New York, where he divides the people in New York into three categories. And he says it's like the settlers, I guess, that bring a sense of passion for the city in a way, but also a feeling of inadequacy maybe that feeds that passion. And I think that was part of it for me, probably.
Yeah, and I mean also too, Andrew himself, right, was a newcomer to the city, sort of sent there to make his fortune in this way that feels, I don't know, it's not the same, of course, as what you were doing in 2012 when you were wandering through Central Park, but you can kind of understand how those feelings are universal to any person who moves to New York with the hope of like surviving in that place in some way that is meaningful and sustaining. Also, I was looking briefly at your reviews in preparation for this conversation, and I saw that I think it was The Guardian, like last year when the book came out, said like the best American novel of the year is by a Brit. And I guess I just wonder, like, with a sort of quotable blurb like that is probably, is it on the paperback? It should be on the paperback. It's funny to think of you sort of sitting in Central Park thinking, I didn't know this story, all these things I have to discover, and then sort of internalizing it, writing this story, and then getting a review like that. It's like the ultimate achievement of the thing that you may have felt insecure about in the beginning of the process. Is there any sense of that, like of you two having made your fortune in this weird parallel way through the process of excavating Andrew Green's story, or is that, am I just projecting weird stuff on?
It'd be nice to make a fortune. I feel like,
yeah, you know what I mean. Like,
yeah, no, totally. I feel like it's funny. Like I probably that thing that I'm sure you have as well, of just focusing on the things in reviews that you would change. Like if you read the review, like you can almost be blind to that. So someone can write a review like that, and like the thing I notice is like, oh, I'm a Brit, like I'm still a Brit. It's like, but I'm kind of, I'm a dual citizen, but I'll never be. I'll always be a Brit. But I feel like the sense of being an outsider was kind of useful in some ways. Like when a real breakthrough was like getting to the New York Historical Society 7 or 8 years ago and getting to read Andrew Haswell Green's diaries and letters that were all boxed up in these like dusty boxes that this kindly researcher managed to find for me. And going through them and just like reading his own accounts of feeling kind of on the outside, and then reading about him arriving in New York at 15, 16 as this apprentice boy, and kind of the sense that began to gather that he sort of created the city that he wanted to find but didn't find at that point in the 1830s. Like all the libraries were private libraries, and he couldn't afford to get any books out. There was no way for him on his salary to get hold of books. all the public spaces, the so-called public spaces, were either like too dangerous, or they were actually, you know, Niblo's garden, where you needed like 2 weeks salary to be able to go and wander around. And thinking about someone like that ending up creating the New York Public Library system, or being one of the key creators of it, and creating Central Park, is kind of amazing, because there's the happenstance personal element within the public space of the story. And that was cool.
Yeah, I'm remembering that scene when he's with Samuel. I think they're at that like private club library place Samuel takes him to, and he sees this garden from where they're standing, and it's like the space in the city he didn't really even kind of know was there. And then Central Park, of course, becomes like that place for so many people. He's still to this day. It's really a satisfying trajectory too for the reader. I guess on a sort of more personal question, there's a lot of really interesting stuff in here about law and lawyering and practicing law and what law means, and learning about systems, and law being a way of kind of creating order out of chaos, or making sense of things. And I'm right about this, right? You were a lawyer in another life.
Yeah.
And that's a part of your past that you sort of share with this character. I'm wondering if you can talk about how that background sort of informed this, or if it made you more interested in the subject material. And maybe even if you feel comfortable reading a little bit from that Artist Gate section, which is on page 99, where you sort of talk about what a great lawyer is and does. There's a little bit of a sort of like tongue-in-cheek quality to it that's lovely.
Yeah, and I mean, it's funny you asking me to read from this bit, because it reminded me that it was called Artist Gate, this chapter. And each chapter is obviously named after a different Central Park gate, and the idea being that there's sort of different gateways onto his life and the different types of people that he was. And I think when I came to write the lawyer one, I'd always felt that like my 7 years as a lawyer in London contained like no creativity and no artistry at all. And then I dug into researching this guy, Caffenborough, who referred to himself as lawyer Caffenborough in all his correspondence. And I realized that there was this kind of almost sad flair to it, this sad artistry. But yeah, so that chapter begins: a great lawyer is not only learned in the law, so that when the brief is laid before him, he may place this fact with that. A great lawyer is also an artist. He is able to march into a land of untamed information and make it adhere to his own idea of order, creating a successful system where only chaos has hitherto reigned. In the mind of a great lawyer, there exists a private tribunal of sense and feeling. He puts good with good, bad with bad, and resigns the false to the false. He strikes at vulnerable points in the evidence of others. He throws firm assertions into cloudy confusion. He finds the affinity that exists between actual events, connecting the everyday with the unexpected, and by weaving lines of testimony within and around the statements of strangers through the most perplexing phases of fabrication, he can bring the truth to light if it suits his client's case, or throw it into shadow if it doesn't. If he can master this art of light and dark, he can, in the process, become rather rich.
Thanks. I loved that passage. I sent actually a picture of it to my friend who is a corporate lawyer. And she was like, sounds about right to me. But there's something about it, I think, that's really like sort of a wonderful way of getting at what is so fun about the tone of this book. It starts in seriousness and sometimes turns around into something a little more playful at the expense of the characters, but always sort of tender, and always, I think, with these like broader truths about the subject that it's circling. And I'm glad you mentioned also the gates, which to me, just thinking about this from a writer's perspective, and also I love too how that what you just read is a sort of fun way of thinking about what it means to write a novel as well. For me, looking at how the book is structured, you know, imagining this monumental task of trying to like hold this whole life and this fantastic death and these incredible achievements all in one story, like I can imagine it was probably pretty overwhelming to think about how you might structure such a story. And then we have these gates, which function as chapters, but are also sort of the real Central Park gates that he named. And I guess I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about how you came to that choice, and maybe even if there's like something from the beginning or something as that sort of entry point that you want to read as part of the answer, that would be lovely. But it just seems like one of those puzzle pieces that as a writer, maybe once you found it, the whole book sort of fell into place, but maybe I'm projecting that.
Yeah, I think at the beginning, as is often the case when I try and start writing anything, like I want to include everything. And I feel like with the temptation with, especially with something you've had to research, whether it's just like an area outside your expertise or like this, like looking into 19th century New York, you do want to throw the kitchen sink in a little bit, I think. And it would drive me nuts in the early drafts of this because I was trying to capture 83 years of this guy's life, and it didn't seem possible. And also, like, every chapter was set in a different decade, and New York was changing so fast that it felt like researching 8 different cities. And then I feel like it sort of came back to me that his mysterious death was an entry point to me. Like, I don't think I would have carried on looking into his story if I hadn't wanted to figure out how he ended up getting murdered on Park Avenue in broad daylight on Friday, November 13th, 1903. And then reading in the New York Times archive, like, all these people's superstitions on that day, and like worried that fate would befall them, that kind of created a space for me to start to think about how to open the book. And that kind of like Virginia Woolf line about, like, you start off writing about death, but life breaks in as usual. Like, I started to then think about, like, oh, maybe just moments of his life break in through cracks in the accounts of his death, and like kind of life sentences coming through death sentences or something. So I could read the first paragraph if
I think that would be great.
So the opening of the book became about his death and became this: the last attempt on the life of Andrew Haswell Green took place on Park Avenue in 1903. News of his murder filled the front page of the New York Times. Father of Greater New York shot in front of his home. The motive was offstage, unaccounted for. Speculation filled the Herald, the Tribune, the Sun. Some writers got excited by the victim's fame or the 5 shots fired. Others stared straight-faced at the date of his death, Friday, November 13th. Citizens prone to long-necked dreams carried pocket pieces on unlucky days like these: rabbit's feet and rusty screws, Pope Pius IX in a paperweight, the pit of a peach named Stump the World, items mute and immune to worry, charms to protect them from bedlam. But at the age of 83, Andrew had no time for fetishes. The things he trusted late in life were grass and trees and weeds, buildings and bridges made of stone. And after his absurd ending had faded from the news, a marble bench was erected in his name in Central Park. This small memorial can still be found overlooking the open greenery of Fort Fish. On Tuesday mornings, a person with cleaning supplies arrives to remove last week's bird shit with a brush.
Great. Thank you. It's funny too how, like, there's a little bit of the way that the paragraph moves that reminds me of what I asked you to read from Artist's Gate too, where we wind up at the end. Anyway, it's really cool, actually, like, hearing you talk about that moment where you found the bench in the park, and I'd forgotten that this was the exact opening of the book until you just read it out loud. And so just to be clear on, like, the trajectory of how the book came, you didn't write this first paragraph. This wasn't like a first draft, first paragraph kind of burst of inspiration. This was a later edition.
Yeah, it was quite a bit later, I think. And I also, I did an event like a couple of weeks ago back at the bench, which was cool.
Yeah.
And I even, like, in a couple of weeks before that, I'd been there and I'd seen the bird shit brusher guy there, like, cleaning it up. but I had struggled for like quite a while in different drafts with like how to bring in there was a bit of first person in it for a while. Like I didn't really
From
want it
Andrew's
to
perspective?
be. No, it was my perspective. It was my
Oh.
perspective discovering his story. And it was almost written like you might write a kind of Joseph Mitchell New Yorker article where he's sort of stumbling into someone else's story and telling it that way. And I had lots of, you know, discussions with my editor about whether that worked or not, and like how much of me should be in it. And in the end, it just became like little mentions of the bench and little, like a kind of slight sense, I think, or hope of like a kind of
compiler.
Yeah, a compile, like someone who like the lawyer, or or like one of the newspaper journalists, or like the detective is trying to piece things together.
Yeah, I definitely have that sense. And I think for me, some of it comes too from just this sort of like playful sort of suppleness and how the inhabiting of the sort of central characters moves. Like we get like riffs of different names when Bessie comes in later, who's a sort of peripheral character. It just, there's a kind of like first person-y energy to some of that sometimes, where you get the sense that like we're inhabiting these different characters, but it's one sensibility, sort of like keeping it all together. That actually felt like really like fun or something to me. But I love that the bench came back as the beginning, because it just reminds me of like such a frustrating thing as a writer that's so often true, which is just like, if you're having trouble figuring out the best place to start, it like often just makes sense to start at the like real beginning of the thing. I don't know why that's so hard to learn, but it feels like something you have to learn like project after, or I do, maybe you don't.
No, completely exactly right. I think like the version that you would tell someone in a pub is like almost always the way to start. And the way I would start in a pub is like, hey, I came across this bench. Like, have you heard of this guy? Because it seems like he did some pretty cool stuff, but also he got murdered. And then I'm going to look into that. but for, you know, for a couple of years, I was like, well, that can't be the opening. It has to be something clever.
Yeah. What is that about? Do you think there's some way that like in 10 years or something, or 20, every book you start, you'll just finally start at the right beginning? Like, is it just part of it? I'm going through something like this now too, where I'm like, wait, I should have just put this in like the right order and time. Like, could it really be? And I mean, in this book too, it's interesting, like how you have this sort of like lovely, we move forward in the mystery of sort of what happened to Andrew, or what happened with his death, like this shot, like what was going on, what were the motivations? And then we also move backwards, right, to sort of all the way through, and then forward again all the way through his life. So there are these kind of interruptions on two different tracks, both of them sort of moving forward, even the story that is in the past. Were the backstory sections, or they don't feel like backstory really, but Andrew's sort of history, was that organized in that way too? Did you have like big chunks, or how did you think about getting that sort of folded into the mystery of his death?
I think at first I had big sections about different times of his life, and I think it was a little bit more hovering perspective. It was a bit more sort of like Dickensian or something. It was like knock off Dickens or something like that, which is probably not something anyone wants to be reading. And then it became like almost like a principle of smaller is better. And thinking about like his obsession with small things, and like picking up litter, and like obsession with mistakes and like small errors and small details of spaces. Like he was like a real detail person. Like if you read kind of his correspondence with the designers of Central Park, and he was the main administrator who was making it happen, and in the end kind of outlasted all of them. But they describe him as just like a nickel and dime guy who just would not get off their fucking backs about all of the details. And so I started to think that like a way to tell his life was through these little private moments and episodes mixed in with the very public death, and to kind of weave and bake in the sense of his achievements, but not make it all about like who was this guy who like achieved a lot of stuff. I was kind of more interested in his little mistakes and moments of private loneliness. And I think we're both fans of the Carol Shields book, Stone Diaries.
I love that book so much.
And that was in my mind at times as well.
Yeah, I can kind of see that now. I wouldn't have thought of that until you said it, but there's something about the movement, right? Of like, what are the things in a life that wind up being the most important thing? How they're not always the thing that you would expect. Or I'm thinking now about the sheep pen chapter later on in the story, right? It's like these small things that can hold every single element of a person and who they become. It strikes me again as like a very sort of, it's interesting to think about your sort of path as a lawyer, your work as a writer, your work also as an editor, which we haven't talked about a little bit, but I would like to talk about a little bit if you want to, and how it maybe makes you, do you think it's helped you be kind of more present to what those sort of like animating stories are in a person's life? Like when you're looking through sort of everything that happened to Andrew Green and you have these decisions to make about what to include, do you think like having that editorial background or even this history of making sense out of chaos from your work in the law, do you think it helped you kind of fine tune those choices, or was that just trial and error? You know, does that question make sense? I guess it
does. I think one thing I think work as an editor, and I'd love to know what you think about this as well, because we've both been in this dual position, but I feel like it brings an impatience to you in a sense, like you sort of you recognize the feeling of reading something where you're expected to invest hundreds of pages in it before you get to any of the moments of joy or surprise or absurdity or humor, you know. And I feel like the research process and law is like this too, for sure. Like, I mean, I used to have to, you know, I worked in a litigation team in London, and you would get all of these files of like people's emails during the discovery and disclosure process. And it's like, there were times when I was just like in a room with other people for 6, 7, 8 weeks, and you're just reading through the correspondence of their life or their profession or whatever. And as soon as there's like a hint of an affair or a joke, even if it's a bad joke, or like even an absurd typo, like it just draws the eye. And I felt like researching his life was a bit like that too, like going through all the like minutes of the Board of Education meetings that he was at, for example. And you just, it makes you alert, I think, to the power of humor as well. Because when there's an absurd, like there was one moment reading through minutes of stuff where it was like it was within a formal board meeting setting, and then there was a line that said that Alderman Lucas, you know, sadly isn't with us. You know, he's in hospital after having mistaken firework for a cigar. And it's like, and it's like moments like that, and it's sort of also fed into this thing of like gathering small mistakes together into the book, like trying to pack as many mistakes that people make in their lives as possible into the book.
It just seems like there's something. I mean, one of the pleasures of reading this is that every chapter is such a distilled, sort of potent moment or view on a character or something that we haven't seen. I have a few more questions for you. I think a question that naturally follows from this a little bit is, you know, there are so many moments in here where it's clear like that you did that research of reading the Board of Education minutes, and I don't know how long that took you, and that you were really sort of like thorough about making sure that you learned everything there was to know about this man. But there are also moments where you can sort of feel, or I suspected the novelist's imagination was at play. Like when Inspector McCluskey, with his cabbage head past sort of trauma from having an unfortunate nickname, is then teased in a very specific way later by the woman he's looking for. I just thought, surely this is Jonathan like playing, right? Like this is you inventing. And I'm really curious about what it feels like to do this sort of like fusion. And maybe you weren't, maybe that isn't an invention, maybe that's really a thing. But I'm curious about that. Like, how did you know when to sort of let your imagination take over? How did you know what moments to sort of choose to infuse with fiction in order to make them maybe a truer expression of some element of Andrew's life or one of these other characters? Yeah, I'm just really interested in that.
Yeah, I seem to really like operating within a framework of fact in some way. Like I think I've got worse and worse at imagining stuff, at sort of like thinking up a story. And most of my favorite novels are just whether they have a root in someone's like personal experience or in another book they read or in a political moment or whatever. I feel like in a lot of those things that I've come to love in other people, it's like there's a bit less of a sense of made upness to it, which seems strange because I also sometimes like complain about I love Jenny Offel and Rachel Cusk, but I don't necessarily always want to read like the knockoff versions of the less good versions of that.
Well, I imagine you probably get that on submission more than like anything else.
Right. But something like this where it sort of, it feels like you can do a lot of research and get the 60% or whatever that is out there to be found right and in the book, and then look at the spaces in the architecture, like the gaps and the facts, and when I think especially like the deep history of this gave me a bit more permission than with my last novel to make some stuff up. Just this feeling that like, well, no one is around to write the autobiographical fiction version of this particular story. And stuff like Inspector McCluskey too, because he wasn't sort of my central figure. I mean, he's the name of the real detective who investigated the case, but with him, like I almost had nothing to go on. Like I found like two things about him. Like one was that he on a St. Patrick's Day parade in the Tenderloin, what was then the Tenderloin district of New York, like he swooped in and arrested all of these people who were portrayed as Irish thugs, and then gave this interview to the New York Times where he's like, I got him, boys, this is the real macho kind of thing. But then the only other detail I could really find about him, aside from his work on the case, was that when Topsy the elephant in Coney Island was executed for being a mischievous circus elephant, he had like found this really appalling and had like spoken out within the police force against the killing of this elephant. And so I was like, on the one hand, like a macho cop, and on the other hand, he was accused of being an elephant sympathizer. And I was like, in the space between those two facts, there is suddenly a character.
There's so much, you can like feel it just when you say that, right? There's like suddenly you see that there's an entire person there, and that seems really fun to me, like what it might have been like to sort of like fall into who this guy is.
And I think I never would have come up with that on my own, right? Like if it was pure fiction and I was just trying to think up what the police investigator looking into the death of this famous New York figure was like, I don't think I ever would have come up with elephant sympathizer. So there's that nice feeling of being surprised by the facts and sort of stirred up by them sometimes, but not having to be completely beholden to them always.
Was there anything that you just changed for the sake of the book? I mean, I guess you don't have to tell us, but I'm curious about that. If there was some sort of like limiting truth that you were like, this is not going to work for my mission here, or it's going to make this less interesting in some way, I'm just going to just not be loyal to it. Like, I guess maybe it's a larger question I'm asking, which is like, ultimately with a novel like this, do you feel the contract you're making with the material is more on the sort of side of truth, or more on the side of like the truth you're after as a fiction writer, which feels like a slightly different project in some ways. And in fact, the novel speaks to that in interesting ways.
Yeah,
along the way. But
I definitely felt free. I felt like I wasn't writing a biography of him, and that I didn't necessarily have to tell you everything that happened, that telling you how it felt was going to be more what I was at work on. I think there was like nothing that happened that in history that like then didn't suit the book and that I ended up changing, but there were plenty of things that I omitted because they didn't fit like what I was interested in exploring in him, and also just like demands of space. Like he went off to London, he studied the park system in London, but like when I was thinking about, I kind of felt that the novel could only really hold like one trip away from the New York locale, and I sort of made that the Trinidad trip because I knew he was there for a year. I knew that he tried to set up this Sunday school, even though he wasn't a particularly fervent believer. And I knew that he'd written down in letters just the dwindling number of people who came to the Sunday school classes. Yeah. And so there's so many, like there's loads of invention in that chapter, but just seeing his obsession with like the loss of these people that he thought he was there to educate in some way, made me think about everything else he may or may not have lost in Trinidad and why he only ended up staying a year.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. That's one of my favorite chapters in the book. And I think there's just, again, this sort of like beautiful way we come to recognize the sort of patterns of the gates as sort of entry points into his life. We know we're going to move in all of these different ways with every chapter, sort of somewhere unexpected. But then there's something about hitting this chapter where it just feels like it enters almost like a different tone and a different sort of stylistic register. And I guess for me, there was satisfaction in that in so many ways. It's not just arriving in the place, but it's also this sort of, it feels like this turning point in his life. It's sort of one of those like hinges between who he was before and this person that he'll become and fulfilling his destiny. So I guess I'd love to hear a little bit of that if you feel comfortable reading, maybe like 2 paragraphs or 3, wherever it feels right for you to stop, just so people can get a sort of taste for the full sort of range of the prose in the book.
Yeah. So this is when Andrew Haswell Green goes to Trinidad in kind of, I think it's 1840. And the chapter starts like this. In Trinidad, he loses confidence in his own imagination. It is a much greener land than he ever envisaged. He had pictured the whole place coated in sugar, as if the product of the work would fairly bury the means. But at first, it's as if he came all this way only to find himself back home. In Trinidad, he loses his sense of time. He loses a week's wages when he falls in the river. He loses his way as he walks back wet through the taramine trees. He loses his understanding of the word free, for the newly freed still seem enslaved in all but name. He loses dignity, more dignity, a little in him still, as the workers in the eastern field raise their gaze to the sound of him squelching his way toward them in exactly the wrong shoes. He loses his ability to keep a straight face. He loses the respect of white workers when he speaks with the workers who are not white. He loses count of the sugarcane he cuts with his bill, the cutting he supervises, the cutting he imagines, lifting stalks to his lips to drink the nectar that blasts away all fatigue. He loses faith for a while in the collective, the us, the we. If he wants to make a success of himself in the years ahead, he will have to make it happen alone. His isolation here feels fitting. New York has sent him away so that he might become more like New York, self-sufficient, whale-lit, slick with his own swagger. He thinks of Emerson, a paper of his that he tried to study on Samuel's advice in Samuel's library, a treatise with the title Self-Reliance. And in his first few weeks here in Trinidad, he loses for a while his instinctive distrust of that text, loses his desire to ask if there is not a less selfish way to live one's life.
Thank you. Yeah, it just, I feel like I've mentioned this in different ways throughout this conversation. And this is such a weird and sort of sticky question to ask, but this is a book. One of the reasons I felt so much energy reading this is that I really felt like you were having fun. I just, how you can feel that sometimes on the page.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you weren't, maybe you were having a miserable time. It feels like you were having fun. Like there was a sort of like flexibility in how you were able to move around in this story, and the sort of like listiness and associativeness of that passage, I think, it gets at sort of some of that feeling for me. And I guess it's a little like cheesy, but was it fun? And how did you find that sort of over and over? And I believe you finished the book. The book came out right when COVID started, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So you weren't writing it. This is not like a pandemic novel. It was completed well before that. But I guess it's really a question to make it a little bit more precise and specific about like how you continue to find that sort of playful energy when you're working on a project for a long time that changes shape on you, as you described earlier in our conversation.
Writing a chapter like that one, the one that you just had me read from, was definitely fun, because I felt like I let myself try something else a little bit. And I think that like earlier in my writing life, like the things that I was going for are different to the things that I'm looking for now. And like that sense for me early on, I would write things and just try and find this uniformity of tone. And just this, that like I was really like, what is the tone of this book supposed to be? I must find the tone, and every page must reflect the tone. And of course, like life isn't really like that, but more to the point, it's like I feel like to finish anything and to enjoy finishing anything, you have to let some of your restlessness guide you a little bit. I mean, you're in the midst of a novel now. Did you
were you reading the subtext of the question?
No, I'm really good. But like with Marlena, did you have that? And like, are you having a different experience with the new novel?
It's funny. I just today when I was working, maybe a little bit because I've been in the headspace of your book for the last few days, I was working on something that was very different from where I've been with the book for a while. I just shifted a little bit, sort of the angle from where I was looking at this sort of piece of the book that I've been stuck in for a little while. And I felt this like real burst of energy. And I mean, I guess, this isn't, it was finished before COVID. It came out at the beginning of COVID. I don't know how much sort of what's going on in the world has affected you as an artist, but I feel like finding energy in art and books finding energy anywhere is hard, or has gotten harder in different ways. But a book like this feels like really like plugged into some sort of like spirit of it being fun to invent, fun to make things up in these ways, fun to look at history, fun to try to figure out how things happened, fun to think about what a mistake is and what a mistake isn't, and what we think are mistakes that turn out to be like the real beautiful core of who we become. There's all this sort of like lovely just energy in it that I really admire. And I guess I just dodged your question in a lot of different ways. But yeah, I mean, I love what you said about restlessness too. It makes a lot of sense to me. I have maybe one more question for you. And then if anyone who is here would like to ask a question, I believe you can pop one in the chat, and John will share it with us. So I guess I kind of have two more questions, Jonathan. I didn't ask you about Mrs. Bray, who is a character who really, for me, makes this whole thing come together, who is Andrew's housekeeper and comes into his life in an unexpected way, even for the reader. And I guess I'm just curious about her story. Like, is she real? How did you find out about her? How much of her life is invented?
Yeah, Mrs. Bray is probably one of the people I took the most amount of artistic license with, because her name pops up in the newspaper accounts around his death as being his housekeeper. And her name also pops up in some earlier texts as being this sort of no nonsense person that was kind of at his side and had kept his house and kept his kind of life together in the absence of any like life partner or kids, you know, that he never had for quite some time. And so I just got this sense, I think that I can't even remember if this is true or not, or if this is something I ended up inventing, but I got this sense early on, maybe there was like a scrap of something around the investigation into Andrew Haswell Green's murder where she'd been like, oh, and I told him this would happen, you know. I think it was like a Friday the 13th thing, but honestly, it could have just been in my head. And around that time, I was reading Chronicle of a Death Foretold, which I think is my favorite Marquez book, just because it has this sense of just, we're talking about playfulness, but it moves back and forth in time, and it also has this sense of like a death foretold. And you know, in that book, you know of the killing of one of the main characters, like on the first page, and I suppose in my book it's the same. And with Mrs. Bray, I just sort of like I had a lot of fun thinking about her being this kind of slightly superstitious character, in contrast to Andrew's rather staid like pragmatism, and just like this you know, this feeling of like, what must it have been like for her to, she did, you know, she witnessed the shooting, and what must it have been like for her to be asked questions by the police afterwards and kind of get her moment with the microphone, as it were.
Which she surely does enjoy.
which she enjoys. And I think there's like a little bit of like there's a bit of my mother, I think, in Mrs. Bray too. I don't think she'd recognize it, but
there's something sort of like, for me, she was one of the most alive characters in the story, and it's just funny to think that she is also the one that you were able to take like the most liberties with. But of course, like hanging that largely invented character onto this story that is in so many ways like a true story, reminds me a little bit about what you were saying before about like the Topsy the elephant thing with Inspector McCluskey and the him being sort of this macho guy in the newspaper, right? Like it's the space in between those facts that the story suddenly can kind of come to life, which is a really like lovely way of thinking about it. We didn't I'll ask one more question, and then we can see if anyone wants to chime in, but we've talked about the book in so many ways, but we didn't actually talk about sort of the core love story here. And I guess how do I frame this to even like let the reader in on what I'm talking about? Maybe you can just speak to it a little bit. There's this sort of, Andrew's missing, he doesn't have a family. He doesn't have the sort of like ties, intimate ties that one might have, one might be expected to have at 83. But instead he has this other story with a friend, Samuel Tilden. And I'm curious about that and how you kind of came into that, which feels to me like a kind of organizing principle for Andrew's sort of life story that intersperses the investigation of his death. And I mean, not to keep harping on the like what's true, what isn't true thing, but how much of that was sort of something that you pieced together from certain sources, and how much of it was something that you sort of invented as a novelist?
Yeah, that was, I mean, there were lots of rumors, like you know, Andrew's friendship with Samuel Tilden, who became the governor of New York and then ran for president, and narrowly missed out to Rutherford Hayes in what was like referred to as the stolen election of 1878, like all these little mirrors of the present. But there were like a lot of rumors out there about them being gay or them being lovers in some fashion, whatever label you wanted to put on it. And you know, I got to read letters that showed like the intimacy of their friendship, and that showed some of their fallings out, and never really came to a conclusion as to like whether these suggestions were true, that they ever had anything other than like a complicated friendship and a kind of platonic longing for each other in some ways. But what was definitely true is that like neither of them married in a time when it would have kind of aided both of their professional lives, and got rumor mongers off their back to do so. And that also, whichever way you look at it, they were the sort of central emotional event of each other's lives. And Andrew would end up being the executor of Samuel's will, and they were just like there for each other. The push and pull of that relationship became really fascinating. And in my mind, it's like, whether you read it as a friendship or like something more than that, there's this sense of, I mean, you write beautifully in this space too, I think, the sense of complicated friendships and like the way the sands and the power around that shift over time. And I almost just started thinking about it in the context of a book like The Remains of the Day, or just something where it's a sort of story of missed love in a sense. But it's been interesting seeing the reactions to the book, because some things that I felt like I left very implicit, other people have decided were like very explicit, and then vice versa. But yeah, that's one of the like big spaces and sort of big questions. But there was definitely something beautiful in the way that they relied on each other, but then the way that like one would come in the ascendancy and they'd fall out of touch for 2 years and come back. It felt very lifelike to me, because it was indeed life.
Tracing it is one of the real like joys of the book, and is one of the sort of things about it that does, I think. I mean, there is, I'm thinking of the Carol Shields again now, like there's something so satisfying, right, about like the novel where you fall into the whole life and you get to see it sort of assembled before you, and wonder as a reader if you, I mean, putting aside sort of like the reality of what Andrew Green truly lived, that you feel that you get to see it made sense for the character who can never know what it all meant. It's like there's some great gift to that. It's like the thing we'll never get for each other, or we'll never get as people. You're able to give to him.
I always think in the Stone Diaries, I was just going to say, in the Stone Diaries, like I always think of the chapter that's composed of letters between the protagonist and, I think it's like the editor of the Gardening magazine. And it's like, I can't remember his name, but at first he's sort of signing things off very formally, and then it becomes like regards Jonathan at the end, and then it becomes like love Jonathan, and then it becomes like love John, and it's like J kiss or whatever. And it's like just seeing the and then things get cold again. And so that sense of just like reading between the lines of someone else's life and correspondence and their relationships it's voyeuristic in some ways, in the way that all of our work as writers is, but it's also kind of thrilling. I think.
Yeah, that was so beautifully put. Any questions from anyone who's here?
I don't have any questions, but I think that is a nice natural place to stop this evening. And I can't thank you both enough for this incredibly in-depth dive into this incredible novel, The Great Mistake by Jonathan Lee, which you can purchase. There's links in the chat. And if you're watching us on YouTube, of course, there's links to purchase the book now at paperback in the description below me. Jonathan Lee, Julie Buntin, hope to have you both in the store in the not too distant future for your next books, where I can drop this fake background and we can all be in the real bookstore. But thank you again for your time this evening. Thank you for joining us. We hope you continue to be well. And to all of our viewers, thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to seeing you at our next event. Have a great night,
Thanks
everybody.
so much. Thank you, John. Thanks, Julie.
Thanks, John. Bye.
Bye.